Hi, this is Marlene, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Stories of the Supernatural. Whether you're watching a video or listening to a podcast, please like and subscribe to us so that you can get notification of when a new show is released. Links to videos or MP3 files can be found on MiamiGhostChronicles.com. Go to MarlenePardo.com for information on new book releases. I narrate several podcast series that can be found on major podcast platforms and can also be listened to via Alexa, Sonos, and other home systems. Look for Supernatural Storytime for scary storytelling, Nightshade Diary for classic horror and adventure stories, Stories of the Supernatural for interviews with different guests on the show. If you want to get noteworthy news about the paranormal world, true crime, conspiracy stories, and anything that is just plain weird, you can visit Strange Than Fiction Stories tab at MiamiGhostChronicles.com or find us on Blogspot. I want to thank you for being part of my audience, and I think you are all wonderful. Hi, everybody. It's Marlene with Miami Ghost Chronicles Stories of the Supernatural. How's everybody doing today? Good? I'm good. Everything is well here. I know the show's a little bit staggered, but we're in December, officially the holidays. I like to differentiate because sometimes I kind of try to run everything together. But anyway, we're winding down towards the end of the year. I tell everybody, I remember when I was a kid, a year was like forever. You told like a year from now, I'd be like, oh, that's so long. Now it's like a year, you blink and it's come and gone. My point being, we're going into 2022 and it's like, huh? You know, what's that saying? Time flies when you're having fun. And even when you're not, it's like another year. So yeah. And later on, we'll have another show because even though we shouldn't do it, you know, this is also the time of year that people start making, what they call it, those, and the reason why I bring this up is, you know, since when I was doing my hypnotherapy, right after the holidays is when everybody had made up their mind to lose weight, to whatever their New Year's resolution was, because this is the time. Everybody, of course, waited until they had a blast or had a good time in the holidays, and then New Year's, it's like, okay, I better get down to business. So I would get a bunch of people coming in to see me in January, and it was really funny because I would even have some of them book an appointment in December to come see me in January. Because they already knew, like, hey, I've been doing this before and I fizzle out. And, you know, it's really interesting because, you know what, doing what I did with hypnotherapy and the subconscious and things like that, believe it or not, it's, it really doesn't matter, you know, as far as, you know, why you're programmed sometimes, you know, your subconscious mind to not go through with something that your logical mind tells you, I have to do this, or I would like to do this, or achieve this, or whatever the case, how you sabotage yourself. And that's basically, you know, what you work at. And I want to say it wasn't like, you know, almost, it's like even a good idea to wait for that New Year's resolution, because guess what? It's a pattern, especially if you've gone through that same cycle of, hey, I go and I just bought a brand new gym membership, or I bought a bunch of clothing so that I could work out and look nice. And well, you know, if I'm going to go, you know, all these things, it's almost like if you hasn't worked for you, which by the way, this is why they would come to see me for hypnotherapy, because I've tried to do this before. It didn't work. You know, it's almost like, let's, how can I say it? Let's start making the change in that behavior by not waiting till the New Year's resolution thing where the crowd is going, because basically you're setting yourself up a little bit of like psychobabble there, guys. But anyway, let me get on to the good. As for the people, the chicken people, I know that I haven't put up my video about the chickens. They're all doing well. You know, it's they're going crazy. As a matter of fact, a lot of them, you know, with this cold weather that I've been experiencing mostly at night, my egg production is totally off. I walk around after them. I go, where are the eggs? Where are the eggs? And my poor chickens look at me and go, huh? You know, that's like, where are the eggs? Man, that cold weather does something to the egg production big time. But anyway, let's get on to the good part, guys. The good part is who as I have as a guest tonight. This is the first time that this guest has appeared on Stories of the Supernatural. Her name is Dr. Irene Blinston. She has seen and experienced, and I quote unquote, out of some weird things. I love it. In her life, these experiences include a religious apparition, lucid and repeating dreams, psychic phenomena, odd electrical and magnetic phenomena involving her body, out-of-body experiences, as in OBEs, spontaneous weeping, the scent of sanctity, UFO sightings, seen Bigfoot, and more. These experiences are what led Dr. Blinston to pursue her PhD in transpersonal psychology, which included the study of psychic phenomena, survival of consciousness after death, encounter experiences, mystical experiences, altered states of consciousness, and more. Dr. Blinston knows that by revealing our experiences, we risk being called crazy or worse. Boy, is that true. But it is this lack of exposure that keeps these aspects of our human potential misunderstood, understudied, and sometimes labeled as pathology. She graduated from the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology in Palo Alto, California, with doctoral specializations in spiritual guidance, creative expression, and transpersonal education and research. She conducted her doctoral research studying a topic that has never been researched before, a first in the field. She studied the impact and lifelong after effects of religious apparitions experienced in childhood. Whoa. So we could talk about so much. Help me welcome Dr. Blinston. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you.
Yeah. I was like, well, we could talk about that and 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 that.
But there's a long list.
Oh no, but great. To me, all of those subjects in and of themselves are fascinating. But let me ask you, how did you become interested in this field to begin with? Was it childhood interest, an event? What happened?
Definitely childhood interest. I was fortunate enough to have a mother who I describe as a closet esotericist, very Catholic, but yeah, we had a Ouija board, and I thought every mother walked around with a pendulum in their purse, and card readings and all of that. So I had that exposure very young, which I used to tell my mother how grateful I was for that, because she never thwarted our psychic abilities. I have 4 brothers. So yeah, and that is how my interest got sparked, because she was there to share all what she's learned with us and practice with us, even as little kids. So it was pretty cool. But what really got me going, I would say, is that probably a profound experience, which I rarely talk about actually, was experiencing a religious apparition when I was between 5 or 7 years old. And that's what actually led to my doctoral research, my dissertation research on the impact and lifelong after effects of religious apparitions experienced in childhood. So I studied adults who had that experience as a kid. Yeah, so yeah, that's how that
happened. Let me ask you, when you had that experience as a child, did you realize right then and there that it was religious, or did you understand it after the fact when maybe you were older?
No, actually, as a child, I was raised Catholic and I went to Catholic school, and this actually happened in church. And I saw this man who I identified as Jesus at that age, and no one else saw him, but I did. And he was right in front of the church. So it was a very, very impactful experience. And I had physical, how do I describe it? Physical sensations and physical reactions to the experience, as in an altered state of consciousness. And then after, it was kind of sad, because I was telling my mother, but she just wanted me to be quiet in the church.
You got right ahead of me on the question, because I was about to ask you, what happened when and if you told anybody about what you saw?
My mother was the only person I told, because I got kind of not a negative reaction, but I knew she didn't believe me. And she just wanted me to be quiet. She goes, yes, I see him. I see him. Now just be quiet.
Oh, because you told her right then and there.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Because I was just like, he's there. And here's the quiet, the priest is up and doing his thing. And, the church is really quiet. And here's this little, 5-6-year-old going crazy.
So where did you see the figure? Up on the altar by the priest?
Yeah. Right in front of the altar, actually. And he was looking at the crowd. He was looking at first he was looking on the other side. It was a small church and from a small town.
Right.
And he was looking on the other side and kind of looking at everybody. And when he looked on my side, his eyes locked with mine. And that's when I have no idea how much time went by. I did receive a message from him. I don't talk about it because I just start crying when I talk about it. I have no control over that. But then I was just so excited about it. I wanted
right. You're a child. You're like,
yeah,
right. Which is what a lot of children do. They think everybody sees it.
Yeah, I was so surprised. I'm thinking, why isn't everybody excited?
Sure, right. Like, there's a guy up on the altar. It's like,
right. Yeah.
Right. That's a typical child reaction where everybody's in on this, and then you realize, were your siblings there?
Yes. Yeah. No one else saw him but me.
No one else.
Yeah. No. And what happened, I think where I had where I could feel the impact of the physical response was when I realized my mother didn't believe me. And my mother was the closet esotericist. If I had told her I saw my dead great grandmother or something, she'd be all over it,
Right.
She's
like,
where?
okay,
What?
yeah,
Tell
I
me
understand
what
what
you
mean. Yes.
But for her to just shut me out like that, then I knew it wasn't safe to tell. And
did
so
she ever ask you any more about it, like when you got home?
No, nobody. No. The woman that was my mother had told me, and this was much when I was much later. I actually wrote about it, but it was when I was in my doctoral program. She said that she remembered, and she said the lady that was in the pew behind us when I was screaming, she's going, "Isn't that wonderful?" the woman behind, and my mother's going, "Don't encourage her. We got to get her to shut up." But no, it was never mentioned again. And, that was really hard because, if anybody was going to believe me, it'd be my mother.
Sure.
So, but
exactly.
yeah.
Exactly.
So I kept it secret my whole life.
And this is the thing. Most of the Marian apparitions with children, same thing. They were thought to be liars or, almost bordering on blasphemous. Like, how could you're a child, and most of them, were poor. Why would the Virgin Mary appear to you? Very
exactly
same thing. And it was almost like
exactly right.
For lack of a better words, even the families were like, you're going to get in trouble because you can't say that you saw that, or yeah.
Right. No, you're exactly right. And I traveled to Europe when I was doing my research for my dissertation and went to Marian Apparition sites. And then, just to experience the locations. And it's very interesting research. But it was the people who I sent out a call for my participants all over the world. And I got people from all over the world responding. But I had very strict criteria. So it was really hard to qualify. Because in my experience, this person who I perceived to be Jesus, I could have walked up and touched him. He was
right. It wasn't like it was like a solid person.
Exactly. We call it a corporeal apparition. It's just like you could hug them. They're there. And so I needed that for, so that I could really narrow down my research criteria.
But you did the criteria on adults, or because I know you wrote the book about children, but when you did the research, was it for adults?
It was actually adults who had the experience as children.
Okay, as children. Okay, I understand.
Right. Okay. And I don't have the stats in front of me right now, but there was a large percentage who either told one person as a child, and like me, was kind of thwarted. And so they kept it a secret their whole life, and they never divulged it again until they responded to my call for participants for my research. And so it was, and then listening, they actually wrote an autobiography for me, but I had them actually do artwork first to describe, because there's a thing about when things like this happen, and anybody who has an experience, whether, any kind of encounter experience is where my specialty is, in mystical experiences. And this can include, alien encounters, or even seeing a UFO, or, seeing Bigfoot or whatever. It's ineffable. It's like, how do you describe that? It's so in order to be able to address the ineffability of it, I had them do art to describe or show or illustrate their experience. And I really wanted to make it easy. I'm like, if your experience was a color, just grab a crayon on a piece of paper and just put, just do that. And that's all you need to do.
Right.
But they did. I mean, I had people, like one person did stained glass. She saw a religious apparition of Mary. And I mean, they really put the work into this. One Native American person who saw Jesus, a Native American person did a beadwork of her experience. Oh my gosh.
Right. Like the memory, that's the thing that you learn. The memory is very sharp and detailed.
Yes, it is. And it's so much easier to do it if it's nonverbal, because of the ineffability of the experience. So when they are able to do it in a nonverbal way to express it, then it's come out. So that's when I had them write their spiritual autobiography, or basically their experience. So then they're able to express it in words. It's just that they need to get it out first. And oh my gosh, they went above and beyond the call.
Because I've been wanting to say this, and maybe I haven't for so many years. Did you find there was a median age that you saw the majority of sightings, or no?
Well, I had, you mean as far as when they had the apparition?
Right, like how old were they? Where you say, okay, the majority of them fell into this approximate age, more or less.
I would say the majority of them were probably, I also cut it off at 12 years old.
Okay, so you're talking, all right, pre-pubescent, pre-teenage. Okay.
Yeah, no teenagers. They had to be 12 or less. Okay. Now, postdoc research that I did, I allowed up to 18 years old. But for this particular specific corporeal religious apparition was up until 12. And I would say the majority of them were probably 7 years old or younger.
Okay.
Yeah. Right. Oh God, some amazing stories. Oh my goodness.
Right. And these, and it's, I'm sure, like you said, that a lot of them, if they told anybody, I want to say even a child sometimes understands that saying it, or that ahead of time they know that might be rejected or disbelieved or told, don't be a liar, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Right. And that's, that was common, actually. So I had, oh my gosh, I got so many emails in response that they didn't qualify, but it's like somebody will listen, know. So I've had, probably 2,000 emails from around the world of people that were sharing their experiences, and but because it wasn't corporeal, they didn't qualify. But
because you were looking for that specific thing.
Yes, that specific. Yeah.
Let me ask you: were these sightings, were they strictly Judeo-Christian, or were we talking different religious beliefs?
I narrowed it down to Judeo-Christian biblical figures specifically, and the no angels. And although I don't discount the angelic appearances and things like that, I just needed it to really be narrowed down. Right. So it was saints, or whatever biblical figures, and Mary and Jesus. And the majority, believe it or not, I'm raised Catholic, so it's like all of the Marian apparitions were the big deal. But the majority of my participants saw Jesus. Yes. You
know what? It's really funny because I was thinking that. I'm thinking, man, if you got in trouble for seeing Mary, can you imagine if you said, I saw Jesus?
Right.
You'd be like, oh.
Right. And it was usually in a calming situation. One instance was a child who was listening or hearing her parents argue. She was in her bed and she was, just like praying. I think she was about 7 years old. at the time, and she said she was just praying that her parents would stop fighting, and it was just the stress that was on her. And Jesus came to her, and he put his hand on her. So there was also physical touch. It's really fascinating.
And this is wow, that is incredible. See, that's the kind of thing that you hear that and it's of all the things that a child, especially at that age, could make up as far as seeing. It's like you would think that would be the last thing.
Well, the thing is, too, this is where you have to be kind of strong-willed when you're doing research like this, because other very material, researchers or scientists who are based in materialism, man, I got bombarded, it's like, it's just fantasy and imagination and all of that. But I was looking at how they were impacted and if there were lifelong after effects. So, I mean, these experiences, even with children, it changed their lives. One child became a healer where, and another child who was probably rambunctious and really kind of a naughty boy type of person suddenly changed overnight and was helping the neighbors, taking out their garbage and helping, elderly people and things like that.
The parent must have said, what's wrong with you?
Yeah. Yeah. But in the, some of the ones that really struck me were, and the most common people that responded to me were healers. And their experience as children is what sparked their healing abilities.
Almost like what you hear also of some people that have had near-death experiences.
Yes.
That some of them, when they come back, some have dramatic personality changes. And I don't want to say personality changes, but sometimes the way they behave or if they've been angry, that the anger is gone.
Right. And their perspective on life is different. Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, this is something that's really fascinating because I wrote a chapter for a book. It was a trilogy on Fatima. We can get to UFOs here, but when these researchers in Portugal were actually investigating, and they were able to go in and actually read the original papers where the testimonies of the children who saw Mary. Right. And this whole thing was, they actually had an artist do a rendition of what they described, and it looked like a space alien.
Well, that's what I read that thing about Fatima, because they were, I understand what you're saying as far as looking at the original, because between then, once the church accepted it, they kind of massaged it. I'm being nice about this.
Yes, this is true. Yes.
But to read the original, I had heard that it was like, in other words, I guess the church wants the Marian apparition to be a certain profile, like this is what you saw. So, and of course, children are unfiltered. They describe what they see. That's what I'd heard, that it wasn't that prototypical Marian apparition that everybody wants to think of as from the religious perspective. How's that?
Right. Well, there's even, if we look at it from probably all of the apparitions, but I'll just speak to Fatima, is just simply because they had, the artists that do like for witnesses or whatever, and they'll draw a picture of what they're hearing. And basically with Fatima, there is also the incident when the spinning sun.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, so that's in the book that I contributed to, it's called Fatima Revisited, and it's the Marian apparition and includes in ufology. Right. And so I wrote about the comparison of what those children had described and what my participants described and what UFO experiencers have described. And it was fascinating. It took me 5 months to write a chapter just because of the research I had to do into experiencers of, alien encounters. And the wording and the experiences were almost identical.
Isn't that strange? Because the thing is, in Fatima, didn't the crowds also witness, the spinning in other words, that you had
Yes,
people saying, we saw the same thing,
exactly.
when the children said,
10,000, I think.
right. And then you're thinking, okay, was this a mass hallucination? You see what you expected to see because it's religious or holy, or,
Yeah.
but this is the thing. Like you described, these religious sightings, whether it's Mary or Jesus, have like a positive, but then you hear of some people having an encounter or a sighting with extraterrestrials or whatever, and some of them are not, in other words, they're scared.
Right.
It's almost like, even though you're describing the similar thing, it's almost like, one sees it as something good and holy, because I'm going to use that word, versus the other one, it's like, I don't know exactly what this is. Should I be afraid? I'm not, that kind of thing.
Well, I've read a lot of, even before I did my research, way back when we were talking about my other book I wrote about the angelic communications, I was part of a UFO or alien encounter experiencer group.
Okay.
And to me, it was fascinating because, and also with the research I did about psychologists who they were doing case studies, and I got to read their case studies. But the initial encounter, for the most part, is frightening. And what I found very interesting, even with people who had experienced some kind of body invasion, where with like if you've learned or done any reading about this, like the scooping, like the scooping or implants or whatever. And so these people who are laying on these, they describe like laying on this metal table and being invaded with no anesthetic. Afterwards, and it's like after they go through a process of thinking about it, at least in the counter group that I was in, almost everybody had a positive, like it was meant for something good, that they were chosen, and they had a mission. And there's something similar with the Marian, or not just Marian apparitions, but the religious apparitions.
Right.
So, I mean, it's fascinating. Not everybody comes out going, yeah, I was chosen and it was awesome.
Right.
But most everybody had a very frightening experience to begin with.
This is what you read about, that especially people that have a history of it, that they say that even from childhood, they have a history of abduction, or sometimes, like you said, that some of them even think that their genetic materials being used. Everybody's reaction is basically that you're being like a lab rat kind of thing. You're powerless. You have no control. And versus the other thing is a totally different feeling. And of course, even though how can I say it? There's no threat. How's that? Because I think that's the problem, that a lot of people feel threatened because they know that this being can do whatever they want to if they wanted to.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and I think, at least for me, because I mean, my name is Irene and I'm a control freak, but it's feeling out of control.
Right. Exactly.
Because a lot of them are paralyzed.
Yes.
And there's a similarity also. You got me. I'm on a roll here because I love this topic so much. But there's a similarity with individuals who see apparitions, and I'm going to just describe children, because I did this too. I didn't watch myself, but I can only imagine what I looked like, because they go into a trance.
Right.
And if you look at some of the filming, the apparitions where they had photography and stuff at that time, they'll go down on their knees and the head goes back, and they're in a trance. And so they also aren't in control when that happens. And I wish I could say I know exactly what's going on there and I can explain that to you. I don't know. But that's, there's something about the energy of the apparition.
Okay.
That, that these kids are, and it's not just kids, it's happened with adults as well.
Right.
But of course, my expertise is in the childhood experiences.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, they go into a trance state. So in many ways, they have no control. Oh my gosh. And some of the, there's apparitions that took place in Garabandal in Spain. And
Mm-hmm.
scientists went in there and they actually, while these girls were in trance, were putting matches and lighters to their skin
And
to
they won't
see
react.
if they would react.
Mm-hmm.
They were trying to burn them to see
Yes.
if, because they thought they were pretending that they were faking.
Right.
Yeah. So it's,
And
so
and the reason why and I guess my thing is though, because that some of the messages that the Virgin was, and I wonder if you came across any of this, which was basically asking, for people, I'm talking Marian, to pray the rosary, to
Right.
repentance, in other words, to avoid, all these bad things, that people had to repent from their sins, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Did you run across any of the kids that had the Marian apparitions or Jesus that got a similar message?
No.
I'm gonna I have my own version. Sometimes I think, to me, it's like, I thought, is this the church saying them? And I have no idea if this is the message that was given to these children, but I'm more of I'm anti-fear. How's that? It makes me think, if the Virgin Mary's going to give you a message, it's not going to be fear or guilt. I can see her saying, pray the rosary or help, it's positive
Mm-hmm.
stuff, but, do this or else. And I was thinking how much of those messages were, the church, once they accepted them as actual Marian apparitions, said, well, we got to make it a worthwhile message via these children, of course, that this is what the Virgin Mary said. So
I think some of that may be so, but we also have to keep in mind that especially when we're looking at the apparitions in the smaller peasant type countries. I mean, Portugal was a little different because they were like killing priests and stuff at that time. Nuns and priests were being killed.
Yes, I know.
It's like a revolution at that time. So
yes.
There was some manipulation there because they were scared.
Right.
The priests and stuff were scared it was going to become popular, which it happened really fast, and thousands of people were going there.
Yes.
So but they did pray the rosary because that was what was
right.
That's
exactly.
what they were
and that's
taught.
What I was saying. That's
yeah.
Exactly. Which is, to me, that would make sense. Where, as far as messages to pray the rosary or for world peace, all those things that I can understand. And as a matter of fact, one time I went, I don't know if you remember the sightings that they had in Conyers, Georgia, of the Virgin Mary.
I know of it. I almost went down there, but I'm not.
I went, but this was back like
research.
In the 90s. I went. This was, and it just so happened I went on a weekday. There was nobody out there because that I believe people would go out there on a certain day of the month or something. There was a timing on it.
Oh, okay.
And, when I went out there, I was expecting people were going to be there, even though it was a weekday. I went in the middle of the day and I went out to the site. And I was out there and, they had statuary, but it was very normal, and I walked around but it was nothing, there was nothing out of the ordinary or anything, because I don't know if you remember the lady in Conyers, she was saying, I'm receiving these messages from the Virgin Mary. And
I knew about that. Yeah.
And the church was very hesitant. They were like not going along with the program as far as saying that it was an official Marian apparition, etc. But it was and I remember that they had what was it that they did? That they were doing the same thing with her. They were testing her or putting a probes on her, like when she went into trance, just to gather, And she was, and it was confusing because it looked like she was not. What was it that they had on her? They had attached a bunch of stuff to her to see what was happening when she was supposedly in trance. And it was like her blood pressure, everything was very low. Everything was like Like, how, you can't will yourself to do that. What she was going in her brain
Right.
patterns. I think they also, one time they were looking at that as far as when she was going into trance. And then I don't know what happened to that. It just, that Conyers thing just faded away. I don't know.
Yeah,
But
I don't know a lot about it. I know a little bit just because I studied, as
right,
many
right,
Marian
right.
apparitions as I could,
Mhm.
and wanted to go to the sites if I could. But I don't know a lot because it was an adult,
Right.
and my focus was on children. Well,
Yes.
adults who, as children, had their
Okay.
experience. But yeah.
Let me ask you, when you interviewed them, did you have, I know you said, okay, the cutoff point is going to be 12 years of age.
Mhm.
Did you have any participants that were young adults? In other words, that this had happened to them within the last 10 years of their lives, or was everybody older? Like somebody that was maybe 20 in their 20s and this happened to them.
Yes, actually. Well, let me think. That's a good question because I had so many responses. But I mean, it narrowed down to 25, but there was men that were in it too, but they didn't want to do the processes. Like they didn't want to do the art or whatever. So they dropped out. So
Really?
I ended up,
Men didn't?
yeah, men
Why am I not
flaked out
surprised?
on
Why am
me.
I not
Yeah, we
surprised?
call it attrition. And so I lost, like, there was 5 guys, I lost all of them. And then some people were afraid. Even though I promised them anonymity and confidentiality, they were afraid because some of them were like well-known people in their field, whether it be,
Yes.
psychology or their doctors or whatever.
Mhm.
So they dropped out. But I ended up with 13 participants who completed everything for me. And of those, I think that it was my postdoc where I had some who were younger, meaning that they were like 20, and then they
Okay.
had their apparition experience when they were like a teenager. So
Right.
it was pretty fresh.
That's
But
pretty
I
fresh.
had one woman who was 70 some years old and had it she had her experience when she was a child with polio.
Oh,
So it was like a long time ago, and she remembers it like, yeah. So yeah, I didn't have very many at all that
were they
any
all
younger.
Christian?
No.
Really?
Yeah. I Native American, raised with Native American spirituality.
That's incredible.
One woman, and she saw Jesus, and then also a Jewish woman who saw Jesus.
See,
Yeah,
that's the one where you got to get your hand around, because if you think, okay, these people are seeing what they expect to see, but it's the unexpected when they start saying, yeah, I'm Native American, raised in Native American spirituality, but I'm seeing Jesus. Her shaman must have been, come here. You saw who?
And she had a name for him. She didn't describe him as particularly Jesus because at the time she didn't know. But when she got older, because as a child, she had a name for him, like the wise one or something like that. And it wasn't until she was older and learned about Jesus, that there was this Jesus person. She's like, that's him.
Hey.
Yeah. And I also had someone from Japan, raised in, Buddhist and Shinto religion.
You know what's really interesting that people don't realize, that there's a lot of versions of the Marian apparitions where the virgin looks like the populace.
Yes.
People always think that the Marian apparitions are the prototypical Mary, as in European looking Mary.
Right. Yeah.
And there's in Asia, what was it? The one in Vietnam. There's another one, Our Lady of Zaytun, which I think is out of Egypt.
Oh, in Egypt, yes.
That Mary is clothed in traditional, I think, what's the name of the one in China? This, of course, is pre-communist China. That she's Asian looking. And
yeah, she's, and this is also Our Lady of Guadalupe.
Yes.
Also looked like a native. From the description.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Now, my people and interestingly, when I think about it, my non-Christian experiencers I'm pretty sure all of them saw Jesus, which is
How did
interesting.
did they all see Jesus? What did they say Jesus looked like? I know this must be like
Actually, some people drew him.
really.
And yeah. Well, even with me, they're saying it's just a statue. I'm like, no, this guy had curly hair and what I saw, brown eyes, curly dark hair. Looked Middle Eastern actually. And as a child, I knew nothing about that. So that's who I saw. And they did did rough drawings or whatever. But they, some dark-haired dude.
Well, think about it. Back, I'm sure because I went to Catholic school too. The prototypical Jesus that I grew up seeing when I was in school was the one like the light-eyed blonde Jesus. He didn't look like what you're just
almost blonde.
He didn't look Middle Eastern. It's like no.
Yeah.
So that when you're saying I see this guy with curly hair and dark eyes and
dark skin, dark skin,
exactly. That is so interesting. As far as that, people like you say, okay, how much are they making up? Well, okay, if you're going to be making it up out of your subconscious mind, you're going to be coming up with what you think versus that this is
right. Well,
and
that's what
did you ever see him again?
I was accused of. I'm sorry, say that one more time.
Did you ever see him again?
In dreams.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a whole other thing. If you know Whitney Stryber, heard of him.
Yes.
I also attended night school, and I was, from the time of my original apparition, I started to have a nightly dream, and it's just interesting. I'm going to be outing myself here, but I'd have this dream every night that I just find myself in this field, like a meadow, so to speak. And there was logs of old dead trees and logs that were in a U shape. And there were like 12 of us little girls. And there was Jesus there. And he was teaching us.
Okay.
And so when class was over, little girls would talk to themselves or whatever, and I'd make a beeline to Jesus, hug him around his waist, and he'd put his hand on my shoulder or hand on my head or whatever. And as soon as he did that, boom, I would be sitting upright in bed in the middle of the night. And that happened like every night until I was probably about 10 or 11, I'm guessing. And then it was like every 3 nights. And then it eventually went to once a week, and then maybe once a month. And then it just faded out. And then I had another one. And all of us little girls grew up in my dreams.
Oh, so in other words, you saw yourself as your age and everybody around you. Okay. Interesting.
Yes. Yeah. We all, and I just remember that we were all these little girls, and then we just got older, and we were just like when you go through school. And the thing that bugged me the most is that, he would be teaching us stuff, but when I woke up, I could not remember what he taught us. It drove me crazy.
But your soul, was like your soul was learning it. So
it was like every night. And then when I was 18, I had another, and all the girls were there. And I beelined up to Jesus, of course, and same thing happened. And that was the last one I had. And there was and I have to say, that I had this feeling of abandonment.
Like what happened, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Why did you leave me? Why did you abandon me, sort of thing. And by the time I was 11 years old, this is another thing, I was a self-proclaimed atheist. That went over well in Catholic school.
How's that work?
I was a self-proclaimed atheist because the Catholic nuns or whatever, they couldn't answer my questions. I was pretty precocious, but they couldn't answer my questions, so I thought they were all full of it. The only thing is, though, is I knew there was something.
Okay.
So it was when I was a teenager, anyway, like after the last visit I had, the last schooling, after that happened, I realized it's not that I'm an atheist, because that's just anger.
Right.
You know, that's my anger, because I know there's something. So still to
Right.
this day, I call myself agnostic,
Right. Agnostic.
because
I
I
know. I
know
understand that.
there's something.
Right.
But yeah,
Right.
so I had that, and I had actually a psychologist
Mm-hmm.
do a regression on me
Okay.
to try and find out, to get me to the place where I could be in class and watching Jesus teach us, so
Okay.
that I could remember what I was being taught.
Okay.
And it was kind of upsetting, because my experience in that regression was that we were being taught about, it was pretty apocalyptic, actually. And that was a little bit upsetting, because no wonder I couldn't remember, for a 6-year-old or a 7 or 8-year-old,
Right.
to see, you know, this, you know, war and desolation. And I mean, it was.
Which is, I was going to ask you, was it always the same thing that he was teaching you? I guess.
I wish I could tell you. I don't know.
Was it a teaching or was it a warning? I guess. You see what I'm saying?
I think this is just me. I really don't know. But I think he was preparing us.
Okay.
To be leaders of some kind, or to help. And
okay.
And so when the book we were talking about before, but the book I wrote that has to do with, what did I call it? Cracking the Angel's Code. When I started to get the angelic messages, which was after I'm in my 20s, I guess, I started to get the angelic messages. Okay. And then I'm being told by them, after this whole process, which I share in my book, Cracking the Angel's Code, but I was trying to figure out what the heck they were telling me. But it was basically, I was being prepared, or being told that I was going to be in a leader position. Okay. When all hell breaks loose, basically, the end times or whatever.
So, what you're saying is these angels were carrying on with what?
I don't know, to be honest with you. And it's not just me, you know, I mean, there's other people. And what fascinates me is people getting the same messages. And I was pretty isolated. I still am, but
right, that you could say, okay, this is bleeding over somebody.
Right,
I heard this from somebody else.
Yeah. So, and I'm born and raised in Northern California, about 3 hours from Mount Shasta. And so these messages were from these angels that, you know, they were like telling me that I needed to get prepared, and that the end times were coming, but they were looking at like it was going to be this transformation. It was going to be great because the angels are going to come back. It was going to be a garden again. So I thought about, and I'm supposed to be able to lead people who are going to stay behind. They even speak about something that really related to me, like the rapture.
Right, I was going to say that.
Yeah, and or how some of the people today talk about the ascension. You know, so there's this whole ascension process, and so all of these things were coming together. So if I was being taught by Jesus about these apocalyptic things that were going to happen, and that myself and these 11, there was 12 of us actually, these little girls, and so myself and the 11 other girls were in some way to be there to help during that time when that happens. So and so the angel messages were also informing me about this kind of thing as well. So
do you think that even though you don't remember them, do you think that if you ever met any of those girls, you would recognize them?
I don't know, but this is where I'm outing myself. When I did my doctoral dissertation research, that was what I was hoping for. I was hoping I'd find them.
Right, that you'd run across and then would be like, I don't know how I know you, but I know you.
Well, I thought that I'm reaching out around the world to find people who had a religious apparition as a child.
Right.
And I was thinking this would be one way that they may see, and I mean, my call went around the world.
Right.
So
and you're thinking,
if they see it, they'll want to be part of my research, and will, that was my hope. I didn't tell anybody that.
Sure. This is
at the time, but that was, regardless, that was going to be interesting research. But really, in my mind, I thought this is one way, because I wanted to know, are they out there? Are they out there still? I still wonder.
Right. Or somebody that I could say, and then all of a sudden you're thinking, this person was seeing, the same thing.
Yes. Yeah. Because I had them describe their experience. So
Right,
I
exactly,
thought, we'll know for sure, right?
How did let me ask you, because it almost seems, do you think, especially when it angels, are we talking, do you think angels and ETs are two separate, or are we calling ETs angels? Because maybe that's just the, you look at ancient aliens that, that this is how, humanity or whoever witnessed them, this is what they came up with.
Right. Well, I think it was one of my aunts, actually, when I was receiving the messages, and I asked them, about extraterrestrials. And if you think about this, it makes sense, that people recognize angels, but extraterrestrials. So basically they're saying like they're the same thing. Like, so in the messages, for example, they said that heaven is a planet outside our solar system.
Okay.
And that the angels and the archangels live on different planets.
Okay. But they're not, and how can I tell you? Because, we always think of, even though, we always think of angels as spiritual or non-corporeal, like you said, versus you think an ET is, extraterrestrial, but still corporeal. Like.
But then again, they walk through walls, right?
Right. They can bend, God knows what they can do interdimensionally.
Right.
We're not really sure.
Well, to me, I call them angels because that's how they describe themselves when they identified themselves as angels, when I was first receiving the communication. But if you've seen the movie Contact, when she's, goes through the wormhole and she's on that planet, and the person who approaches her was her father, but it wasn't her father, but that was something that she could not be afraid of or accept. So I feel like even the apparitions of Jesus, the apparitions of Mary, angelic experiences that people have, that this is just me, but I feel they're either extraterrestrial or other dimensional.
Okay. Right. And I've heard of that, as far as, because sometimes, let's say we think of traveling, or, there's a lot of things that we just haven't conceived of yet. Not, because we're just figuring out, on a, how can I tell you, as far as dimensions and wormholes and all of these things, now is when we're really getting it. Whereas maybe this, we'll call them species. What else? I mean, whatever they are, they're around the curve on that. And it's very interesting because it makes you think, I'm sure you've seen Ancient Aliens, and it's like, have they been here all this time? And they were made into angels or gods, demigods,
Right.
Or are they, do you think that in a lot of times you hear the same thing, even from, because at one time, I hadn't gone in a while, but I belonged with this group, which was, they would put on MUFON presentations. It was a UFO awareness. And I spoke to quite a few people, after the meeting after the meeting, where people would say that after they would have had a UFO experience, not even an ET, just a sighting, that then they would start having paranormal experiences. Right. And that some of this stuff was following them around for years. And the triggering had been a UFO sighting. All right.
Right.
And it was, in other words, it wasn't like, I saw light in the sky and that was interesting and something never happened. These were people that started having events happen to them where they lived to them. And it was after that UFO sighting.
You're right. And that's the same with the apparitions, where I was talking about a person becomes, hands-on healer, or their, massive psychic abilities.
Right.
Those are the kinds of changes. And, we can't really say, I saw a UFO when I was like 9 years old.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a whole, God, we could talk for hours.
I was
But
gonna say, and how did you, let me ask you, did you share that with anybody, or were you like,
well, it was in the neighbor. What was so odd, and just like when I had the religious apparition, I was probably about 9, and there was this. It was really big. It was a saucer shape, and it was fluorescent orange,
okay.
to my eyes. But we were out playing. All the kids in the neighborhood were playing in the street. The parents were out sitting on the porch and all of that. And this thing slowly hovers over, and everything stopped. It was silent, and everybody was looking at it. And then it just kind of moved over and just went over, because I'm in Northern California with forests and lots of trees and stuff. So then it became where it was out of sight.
So everybody saw it.
Everybody saw it. And then as soon as it's out of sight, everybody starts playing again, and no one says anything. And I'm like, whoa, wasn't that something? And they're looking at me like, what are you talking about?
Exactly. And that's incredible, because it's like, how do you why am I the only one that thinks it's unusual?
Well, there's this phenomenon, God, like I said, I have done such interesting research and had so many interesting experiences, but there is a phenomenon that if the brain can't handle it, or if it's beyond the comprehension of the brain, that the mind will block it out.
Yes, it does.
And I see this in a particular research we did with something called the Psychomantium, where people who have these experiences in this, Psychomantium chamber or tent or whatever, they have these experiences and they're in there for an hour. And then when you go to open the drape to bring them out, they're like, nothing happened. And so you have to take them in and do a post interview with them and ask them each step they took in the process while they're in there. And then they start saying things, and it's like, they're just like, I'm like, I think something happened, after they're describing all these things, but the mind is protecting them.
Let me see. There we go. You know what? What's really funny is I would do, when I would do past life regressions as a hypnotist, I had people that came in with these expectations about what their past lives were. And I would say, okay, well, you know what? We'll just let your mind pick what's the most appropriate one for you to see. And a good portion of the time, it was not what they expecting, and it was very tame. As in, whatever. And I would say, do you understand your mind? There's an understanding once you get there that you realize this is you. Even though it might not look like you, it's you. I go, your mind is never going to show you something that you could not handle. In other words, where maybe they drew and quartered you and hung you at the, if you cannot handle that, you're not going to see it at the very beginning. Or it might show you something else that might be more appropriate versus that. And people don't realize that something like that, your mind is always going to try to keep you sane, which is sometimes where you have people that they lose that memory of a certain event, and then little by little, it'll start coming back. A couple of years later, they might start having vivid dreams, and it's just their subconscious trying to ready them. And you know what? There's memories that you're never, ever ready to see. They're traumatic enough.
Right.
That because your mind at all costs will try to keep you sane.
Exactly.
If something is so overwhelming, and everybody's got a different threshold, by the way. You show something to some people and they're like horrified, but they can handle it. Then you show it to some other person and it's forget it. They'll be gone.
Right.
Just like what you were describing, as in this, everybody's watching this thing and everybody's like, okay, I'm not going to go through that door. So we'll just pretend that didn't happen.
Exactly. It happens. A UFO encounter or sighting anyway happened again, as with my business partner in Henderson, Nevada. And we were at a Starbucks outside and we were chatting and the place was full. And then this blue beam diamond shaped thing across the street where there's nothing built out, it was just desert. And this blue thing, diamond shaped, emanating blue light, came down and it was just hovering over the ground. And then it like had this blue beam that went to the ground, and then it just went up and disappeared. Wow. And everybody was, I mean, it was dead silent. Everybody was looking at it. And then after it disappeared, everybody just started talking again. And my business partner, who he's passed away, but he was really into ufology, and he was going, "We just saw a UFO."
Oh, at least he was.
Yeah. And I'm like, we sure did. But everybody that was there, now somebody did because it was in the news. Somebody had mentioned it to the news. But for the most part, the people at the Starbucks outside were just talking away like nothing had happened. And I had this flash of my childhood. I'm like, wow, been here, done that before. I can remember this kind of experience.
We are creatures of habit, more than people think. And it'd be so surprising what we ignore if that's going to interrupt our little schedule, our reality. It's like, oh my God, if UFOs and ETs exist, what else that I thought is only like movies is real?
Yeah, and that frightens a lot of people.
Yes, it does.
Yeah, the whole UFO aliens coming. There's such a negative connotation in a lot of people's minds, like even dangerous.
Right.
So it's just too frightening to deal with.
It becomes, the horizon becomes very foggy, because if you start entertaining that they're real, and then what else about my reality is that I think doesn't exist is real. I mean, and some people it's like, no, that's just, I can't, no, I need my,
exactly, right. Yeah.
I need my reality to be very controlled and very no surprises. Not that kind anyway. Because the next thing you know, it's like, and of course I hate to say it, but Hollywood is also, because everybody's envisions the worst, like Independence Day.
Right.
War of the Worlds.
Right. And I do believe there's good and bad. When I was in the group of experiencers, alien encounter experiencers, the person who ran that group, he just felt that all ETs are benevolent. And I'm just like, no. Just like people, they're not all benevolent. You have to discern, it's like you have to, there's good and bad in everything, including way out, out in space, or even interdimensionally. I think if we look at it from that perspective, that everybody's benevolent besides us, then we're being a little too naive. And I respect the man, I respect him. But I feel like that's wishful thinking in my view. And maybe I'm just, I'd like to think I have a more balanced view, but maybe I'm one of the, I should work in Hollywood. I don't know.
This is the thing. we also, and some people say, okay, you know what, when you try to put and when I want to say our morality, I'm going to say overall human, what we consider good and bad. Maybe to us, let's say, abducting subjects and dissecting them, maybe like with the cattle mutilations, to us it's horrific. Like, how could you do that? Especially to a human being. But maybe, their moral compass is not the same as ours. How can, you know what I'm saying? To us, it seems evil. How could you do that? But maybe their intentions, if we're giving them the benefit of the doubt, they could out and out be like very callous, the ones that do that, and say, hey, you know what? We're not going to anesthetize this person, whether it's a human or another type of animal, because we need to do our scientific whatever.
Right. And also, too, if we're looking at it as an extraterrestrial or someone who's a different species, they may feel no pain.
Right,
so
exactly.
No concept of
For
what
all
pain
we know,
is.
they don't. Then they're, they don't understand.
Exactly. I mean, that's a real possibility.
Or the alternative is that they torture, they don't care.
That's another. God, we could get into so many. It's like people might call them conspiracy theories, but there's, different thought processes about the use of blood, or, having the adrenaline, that fear, and they want that.
Exactly. And I've heard that theory as well, that what the hormones that the body produces when you're under intense fear, like, I mean,
Mhm.
real, yes, your
Right.
body shoots off a bunch of different hormones, everything that,
Right.
yes, exactly. And by the way, same thing that happens with animals. When animals are
Yes.
killed or slaughtered, it depends. All of that plays in as well.
Right. And
Um,
people eat that. I'm a vegetarian.
I'm
So
not. I'm not. But I'm a hypocrite. I'll tell everybody. It's like I have
well,
chickens, but you couldn't pay me to kill a chicken for anything in the world. It's like
well, the
my
thing
chickens
is,
grow
there's
old, they stop laying eggs, and
humanely.
they, it's like.
Well, I eat eggs. I mean, and I've had chickens, but I don't eat meat.
But I noticed that you'll have chicken people that call their chickens like after a couple of
Oh yeah.
years, and I'm like, are you kidding me? I mean, I have an 8-year-old. I have chickens that are 7 and 8 years old. God knows
Right.
they'll lay an egg once a month if I'm lucky, and it's like, nah, forget it. But yeah, but
Yeah.
but as far as that what you were just describing as far as the and let's face it, what's more fearful than torture and imminent death, but
Right.
as far as to
Yeah.
produce that type of reaction in the body at all
Right.
levels. And
Yeah.
I've
And
also heard that there is more than one type of extraterrestrial,
oh yeah.
that some of them are more hands off and they're observers. There's others that are um but they're more conscientious as far as when they look at humans or examine them, and then they're the ones that are forget it. These are
Right.
the ones
And
that you don't want to fall into their hands.
right. I mean, there's so many people that talk about
Hmm.
extraterrestrials, and the different species, for lack of a better word,
Yes.
different types of extraterrestrials, where there are benevolent ones and there are malevolent ones.
Right.
And I think within a species, there can be both, just like with us.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
of course. God knows,
Yeah.
yes. Yes. There I don't see, and maybe there's a where that you would say, well, why don't the good ones, but maybe they're one of these, like, we're all equal. I won't interfere with what you do and you don't interfere with what I do, and let's call it that, but
Right.
it's
Right.
a very
Yeah.
unusual um and and of course, I'm sure you've heard that the attraction supposedly for Earth or for humans is our genetic material. That's
I
also
have
another
heard
thing.
that. Yeah. Yes.
You know,
Especially if they're coming from a dying planet.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. That we have very rich genetic material. Um, and of course, then you go into the hybridization, that's what they're here for. Um, I mean, it could go in so many different ways with that.
Right. Yeah.
Uh,
I mean, that's like, what do you say? Like, that's a 6 beer conversation or
No,
something.
well, and exactly, and this is the thing. I agree with you, like what you said about, the person that thinks that everything is kumbaya with the ETs. Let's go and assume that they're for real, and then the other one where you don't want to have this fear reaction because all of a sudden we're told the ETs are coming for you, and everybody's like, "Oh my god!" It's like
Right.
there's got to be a happy medium here.
I agree. And the thing is, that's where I think, and not to be like mean in a way, but people lack discernment
Yes,
and trusting in their own physical response. But most of the time, I think it's due to programming,
yes,
which is like, watching movies where they're all evil, or well,
yeah.
even with evil people for that
Hmm.
matter. But this is where critical thinking is really important, and to use one's discernment based on our sixth sense, in our intuitive parts of our being. I mean, that's how people survived, when they were running from saber-toothed tigers.
Sure,
It's like being able to sense an environment, and is it safe or is it not? So
exactly.
at
And
least that's my view. I'd like to
there's a
think of it.
book that was written, I want to say in the 90s. I'm not sure. It's called The Gift of Fear. And if I
I've
remember
heard
correctly,
of
I
it.
believe the author used to be one of the profilers for the FBI. And
Oh,
basically, he was talking about how, exactly like what you said, that you have this instinct of fear, that fear's triggering you. And they did studies of people that had been victimized and survived, obviously. And most of them described where prior to the attack, whether they were being followed or they were ambushed or whatever, they kind of felt that something was wrong.
Yes.
And they ignored it.
Yes.
That my imagination is running away with me. That's not real. That's self-critical voice that you got, like, oh. And they said that all of them, almost all of them, prior to being attacked, they couldn't pinpoint it. They couldn't say exactly what it was, but something, the alarm bells were going off and them telling them, leave, go, or just lock the door, something. And that's why the title of the book is The Gift of Fear, because in other words, there's moments where it serves a purpose.
Right. Yes.
And like you said, I think a lot of times we worry too much about, like, what are people going to think if I just run away?
Right.
Who cares?
or when, I'm scared that something's there and, people are going to think I'm an idiot.
Yes.
But this is why in my research, I wanted people who had the experiences before 12 years old. Yes. So they weren't as readily indoctrinated, especially the young ones.
Right.
They were still open. And so they weren't as inclined to question what they experienced. And to me, that was like the best data to get, is untainted data.
Right. The child doesn't overanalyze it. Right. As to how could I be seeing this, or what is that, or all the things that an adult thinks about, like talks themselves out of it. A child just sees it and accepts it.
Right.
Whatever it is.
Right. They're just, I hate that we lose that, actually.
I think part of it is maturing, and like you said, a lot of it also is that you're told grow up, or we're kind of like,
and thwarting, where I was so lucky with my upbringing with my mother. She actually had Zener cards, and she would train us to enhance our psychic abilities. Sure. So we were never thwarted as children, at least from my mother. So, that's why it was so odd that she didn't believe me about my religious apparition. But this is highly unusual compared to your typical American family.
Right. But you know what? I'm going to tell you something, Irene. And because I've spoken sometimes to people who have had supernatural experiences as children, same thing. And they get, sometimes they'll get the parents that are understanding, and there's others that are told, shut up, what? Yep. And I say, once upon a time, things like that carried a certain type of stigma. Yes. So some of these parents were doing their best to protect you, because being odd, even in that, something like that, it's like, this is going to expose my kid to either ridicule or worse. So sometimes this is the best thing the parent knew how to do to take care of their kid. Like, don't talk about that. Don't say you saw that.
Right. Yeah. In fact, you just made me think about a person who wanted to be in my study, but it wasn't an apparition. She wrote me about having this stigmata.
Wow.
And when she was a little girl, her foot was bleeding. And she showed, I think she was African-American, if I remember correctly, in the South. And she showed her grandmother. She goes, look, my foot's bleeding. It keeps bleeding. And her grandmother pulled her sock. I don't know what she did as far as covering the blood or whatever, and pulled the sock up. And she goes, you'll only tell me about this.
Okay.
It's like to protect the child.
Right.
So
I know that the method was maybe not the best, especially for a child.
Right.
But sometimes an adult that's been around before is thinking, the last thing I want. And unfortunately, that's the kind of thing that people don't forget, schoolmates or teachers or it's that weird kid,
Yeah, exactly. Which I experienced because I was, because of my mother's training, I was just openly psychic, and without realizing it was reading people's minds and telling them what they were thinking without knowing I was even doing that. But people were afraid of me. I really had an unpleasant childhood.
Let me ask you, how was your psychic abilities working? Were you clairvoyant? What was it? Or you were reading people, auras? What was going on?
I just call it knowing. I have it's not like, somebody will ask a question, and
Mhm.
even as a little kid, I would just answer it. And I think I have no idea where that came from.
Okay.
And so I just call it a knowing. It's like an innate knowing. And I actually worked as a psychic in the 90s. That was because I'm also a professional astrologer, but I did psychic work. And that's, I have no idea where it comes from. But because I was raised, I don't have a filter to drop it off, to cover it up. It was helpful in that work. So I was able to help people.
I tell everybody, sometimes when, sometimes people get that gut feeling.
Yeah.
Don't get on the plane. Don't go down that road. Don't whatever.
Yes. I think people
let's use the worst case scenario, the plane that if the people were to be alive to ask, how many of them had that inkling, I shouldn't get on this flight.
Right.
Okay. Or they had a partner or a friend or somebody that said, don't go on that flight. And they're like, of course
right. I can only imagine about the person who did the warning and it was just, ignored. You're like, you're an idiot. And they get on the
exactly.
God.
Same thing, you go down, I go, let's say you're a certain road and you don't go down that road and there was a horrific accident, but let's say you listen to your instinct. When you dodge the bullet, you really don't know that you dodged the bullet. You don't, because you dodged it. In other words,
right.
So, it's really weird that sometimes our instincts, our inner guidance, we dismiss it. And a lot of times it's like what you said, because we've been programmed by our authority figures, parents, whatever, teachers.
Right.
No, don't be weird. That's your imagination. That's too out there. So we kind of discount it. Unfortunately. Yeah.
It is. It's very unfortunate. I think that I wish that every child was raised in the way I was.
Wow.
And then that they trusted.
How about your siblings, Irene? Did any of them ever have later on in life any type of unusual experience?
Oh, yes. I have 4 brothers, and all of them, and just interested in UFOs, except for one. He's a Capricorn. He's the only grounded person in the family. But, when we were kids and my mother was teaching us, we were doing the Ouija board, or my mother did spirit writing, which has to do with my book, The Cracking the Angel's Code. That's where the angel communication came from. They all did it. Even my most grounded brother, who poo-poos all this stuff now, but he's in there writing away. It's like contacting the spirits or whatever.
But you'd be surprised. Some of the people, the doubters, are sometimes, there's a reason why sometimes they're the ones that most see or hear or experience, but they kind of like say, I can't deal with that. So they like, nah. Yeah.
Well, I'm telling out my brother, but he's just kind of like, that's all BS, now.
Right.
But I know, he could not have bypassed our childhood,
Right.
So I know that he's got in without, getting overly dramatic. I think he has kind of a second sight or a knowing, but he's not going to share it. But my other brothers, most definitely. I mean, some very impressive or really interesting experiences that they've shared, at least, within the family.
Well, I've said this story before. I have an aunt. She's in her 80s now. And when we were growing up, she was very much ghost and all that's nonsense. And, you brought up that subject, anything like that, she'd be like, you're crazy. That's all BS, blah, blah, blah. One day we're having a get together. This was a few years ago. And they're talking about, and she and my mom, they were, they attended the Catholic school, like a boarding school where you stayed there.
Yeah.
And this was a very old, school church complexes. And she says she must have been like 6 years old, the equivalent. She was in first grade. And she says that this was very old buildings. And she says that all of a sudden she looked at the doorway of the classroom and she saw an altar boy with a very sad face. And this was the time also that the classes that were not co-ed, it was an all-girl thing.
Oh,
and she's a little kid, and she's thinking, what is an altar boy doing here? And he says that she looked like really sad. And she looked like as a kid, it looks very solid. And she just looked back, he was gone. He had disappeared. And she's saying this story, and I'm like, you saw ghosts. And all this time, you've been telling everybody that would hear, like, it's nonsense. And
right.
No, okay. And then she just changed the subject. But she, like you said, when you're a child, she didn't think of it as a ghost. She was in her mind, she's thinking, what is this 6-year-old altar boy? I mean, this little boy, altar boy that looks all sad, very serious, standing in the doorway of the classroom. And then he just, she looked and he looked and he was gone.
Then he was gone, yeah.
And he was gone. And, in other words, he would never have been there to begin with, even if he was, for real, because this was the all-girl part of the school.
Right.
So sometimes even the most ardent disbelievers or proclaim that they're disbelievers.
Right.
If you ever get them to fess up, they've got some stories to tell.
Right. Well, I think too, if they block it out, I think it will shake their world paradigm. To have to even remember, admit it, because they have been so indoctrinated throughout their education and then their exposure to other people. So many people, I mean, unfortunately, in my view, there are a lot of people that way.
Yeah.
Sadly.
But there's a lot of people that if you get them, they have at least a couple of stories.
Oh,
but
yeah.
They say, well, you'll keep it to yourself, right?
Yeah.
And then
keeping secrets for sure.
Irene, it has been absolutely wonderful to speak to you. Let me ask you, do you have any projects, any new books or anything that you're planning now for 2022 or beyond?
Well, right now I've got a book is sitting at a publisher.
Okay.
I got a publishing contract back in May, and it's a book that it's alternative. Well, it's an alternative way of healing grief. And it's about the Psychomantium research. So if you know about Psychomantiums.
Yes.
So at my school, we had a Psychomantium research project. We called it the Bereavement Project. And so I'm just writing about, and it's kind of scholarly. So I didn't want to write it that way, but the publishers are more on the scholarly side. So that one, but it won't be out for probably another year and a half because it's traditional publishing.
You know what? I had never heard of the use of Psychomantium for grief.
Really? That was what it was originally for. Yeah.
No, I had not. So another year and a half? Wow.
Yeah, unfortunately. Yeah. Self-publishing is so much faster because you're in charge of everything. But when you go through traditional publishing, it takes a while.
Let me ask you something. Is this like the same format where you looked at case studies of people that tried it or
well, this one, it's almost, it's borderline could be used in a classroom. The first part of the book, I talk about, grief, which is basically for death, because that's who we brought in, people who were grieving the death of a loved one. And then the second one, I just talked about the different kinds of grief and the grief theories. And then I got more into, how people will heal from grief. And then I start talking about the Psychomantium and the developer of the Psychomantium, Dr. Raymond Moody.
Yes, Dr. Moody.
If you're familiar with him.
Yes.
He's a fun guy. But anyway, so then I'm talking about the Psychomantium, and then I start talking about the participants in my research. Now, this is a rough draft, and I'm at the mercy of the publisher. So I wrote all, what their experiences were, the different categories of experiences, like, people who had messages, people who didn't, people who saw apparitions, which is really rare, who heard messages. And so I described those. And then I talk about, as facilitators, because I was a facilitator, and other facilitators, what the experience, how it impacted us or what our experiences were, and then how it can be used. for things beyond just death. So
let me ask you, did they overall, did the people have that using the Psychomantium, was it comforting for them as far as the grief?
Yes. And little did I know, because we took over 100 people through in our research. And I think there was like one person who had what would be described as a bad experience. Okay. And we were really strict about screening our people because they could not have been diagnosed with, well, they couldn't be on medication for any kind of psychotic. Obviously, that you don't want to put them in a psychomantium. Sure, but this one person got through, and they didn't describe what the experience was as bad, but they knew they needed to go and see their psychiatrist and see their psychologist, and they were, they made plans to, made appointments that day.
So in other words, they what was it? They didn't tell you guys ahead of time that they
somehow they slipped through the screening. Okay. And and we were pretty strict about the screening. Yeah. But that was the only one. Either it was a neutral experience where it was, but that they were very comforted and at peace in the Psychomantium, and some were like massively transformative. And I had one of my people had a massively transformative experience. She was suffering from what we call complicated grief and or prolonged grief disorder. And it's a 3-hour process. 3, she talks about the whole, the dead loved one, an hour or so in the Psychomantium, and then an hour of post-treat, we call it post-session. But she was really wrecked. And when she came out of the Psychomantium, the woman was absolutely transformed. Wow. I mean, even for me, it was like, it impacted me just to witness her change. And we also were testing if it lasted over time. And we, I think we sent a month later or 2 months later to see what their responses were to a questionnaire about, the level of like how much love was there, grief was, pain or whatever. And all of them, it lasted over time. In fact, it never went away.
Right. In other words, that it wasn't like, 3 months later, they're back to, another way, it wore off.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. These were permanent changes for the people who had experienced transformation of their grief. Yeah. Pretty amazing.
So interesting. Wow. For my podcast listeners, what is your website address?
Oh my gosh, my websites are so old. But if they're interested in learning a little bit more about the Psychomantium, my website is called The Portal to Healing Grief.com. It's very old, but it has some information there. And if they're interested in just some of the different things about supernatural stuff. And it's not updated, but there is some interesting things on the website. They could just go to blinston.com and that'll take them to my original website.
Right, because I'll put a link to the website on the credits of the show, but for my podcast listeners so that they'll hear it also. Again, I want to thank you. It has been absolutely fascinating speaking with you. Wow.
Thank you. It's been fun. I love this topic. Can you tell?
Yes. We both do. We're like, yes, I mean, God. Again, thank you so much. And I'm hoping after the new year, I'll get in touch with you again. And I would love to have you come back and we could talk some more about this.
Oh, I'd love it. Yeah. Yeah. You just get me going. Yeah. Anytime. Yes. Anytime.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Bye-bye. Wow. This has been so interesting. You know why? Because she talks about what so many of us sometimes think about, and I've come up, I had read some of the things, even like, let's say like Lourdes and Fatima and, all these, those are the most, I want to say, more well-recognized Marian apparitions, if you want to call them that, religious, that, like I said, you hear of cases of stigmata, which for anybody who doesn't know is when you manifest on your body the same wounds as Jesus, which of the crucifixion, like in the hands and in the feet. All right. And then there's, of course, the Marian Apparitions, which is where Fatima and Lourdes, where children saw who they described as the Virgin Mary. And then they they said about the messages that the Virgin had. And of course, all these things at the beginning were, I don't want to say dismissed by the church. And I can understand why they would want to be careful about it. But a lot of times there was a resistance. For example, the children in Fatima, these were very poor children, peasant children. They, in other words, like, why would they be chosen to be visited by the Virgin Mary? Why, So there was always that resistance to it. And it's almost like one of those things like what, and of course, when she described it, somebody looked at the original transcripts of what these children described. All right. It's very unusual because I had read about, like, was this the Fatima apparitions? Are we talking an extraterrestrial visitation? And I know there's people out there going, well, why can't it be a religious with the Virgin? It's like one of those things without having been there. Okay. And again, you have to understand part of it. Like I told her, how much did the church massage this as far as what the Virgin said to the children, etc., once they decided to accept it, okay, as an authentic apparition by the Virgin Mary. Because remember, once these sites happen, you get thousands of people coming on pilgrimage. They usually build a church. There's miracles that are performed. I mean, you name it. And it's like, in other words, my belief is that once the Catholic Church decides that it's an authentic apparition, they want to make sure that the message that's put out is the right one. That's why I asked her, because I don't know. I would think that the Virgin Mary would not try to put fear or guilt into people if that was her message. She could say, pray the rosary, pray for peace, this, and that. But that's just my own personal belief. But I think that's so fascinating. How much of it are we talking truly spiritual, as in the origin is divine, or are we talking the origins, let's call it non-divine, because if the origin is another species, as in extraterrestrials, let's face it, that's not what we would consider divine. Most of us would be like, okay, are we being played? Are they giving us the version that fascinates us, or is that we're capable of understanding? We're thinking, yeah, we're dealing with a divinity, Jesus, God, the creator, whatever you want to call it. I don't care. But nowhere in there are you thinking that this is another species, or flesh and blood kind of. When I say flesh and blood, whatever they're made of, kind of thing. To us, it's like no. It's like that doesn't work that way. I don't want to be, if I'm going to do some type of adoration, it's not going to be to ET. You see what I'm saying? Or again, how many of these sightings sometimes, and I'm not saying maybe there is a divine, the divinity, creator, certain experiences that people have that absolutely have nothing to do with ET, with an ET source. Okay. There's others that are sourced out of ET, but maybe when they were witnessed, the people at the time couldn't describe it as anything other than something God-like or from a divine source, because there's no other way that they could describe it. And then, of course, the story, whether it was written or oral tradition on it, always places that event or that character as a divine character. It's a real mind bender, isn't it? And I think it's fascinating when she says that she saw Jesus. And, I could so easily imagine that. You're a 5 or 6 year old in church and you're seeing this guy up on the altar, and you're like telling your mom, hey, don't you see him? And your mom's like, be quiet. It's that. Because again, we have to, I think, like what she was talking about, the conditioning, that we always think that the person that's going to have a religious sighting, whatever your religion is, you either have to be a shaman or the guy sitting on the mountain, that hasn't eaten food in 6 months, or, an ascetic or hermit or a highly religious person. Something like that, or penitent, sometimes like, in other words, these are the people that think, well, if they're going to have a religious experience or religious sighting, it's going to be one of those. Why can't it be children, ordinary children? Even though I'm sure from she described, there was other people beyond the the childhood that had them, but I'm glad she narrowed it down, because at that age you're more accepting. You see it for what it is, whatever it is. That you say, wow, it could happen to anybody. That's the way it should be. Whether it's because you, as that child, have some type of, what do you call it? More vigilance, that there's something that you notice things that maybe others don't, and that allows you to see things. And by this, I don't mean conjure things. I'm not saying make up, but sometimes people that are more aware, they kind of see things that other people don't pick up. It's almost like you see what you have eyes to see. In other words, it doesn't qualify, well, who are you in life? You could be just a normal, average, everyday kid, and you're going to see this. And unfortunately, that's what happens a lot of times when people say they saw things, or as a kid, it's like, no, you can't, because you're nobody. You're just a kid. Put your hand down. Imagine her mom. What? Be quiet. People are going to stare. They're going to ask, who are you seeing? And the next thing you know. Yeah. And again, I wasn't kidding. I know some parents don't want to go down that road with their kid, because they, for lack of a better word, they want their kid to be average. And when I mean average, I don't mean average as in stupid, but they realize, if my kid gets that type of reputation, it's going to hurt them. They might get ostracized by their friends at school. They might get ostracized by the teachers. They might get ostracized by their neighbors. Believe it or not, and as parents, you don't want that for your child, because that brings a whole thing of problems with it. And it, sometimes parents just don't know how to handle it too well, because the child feels like, why don't you believe me? You of all people. Sometimes the intentions are good on behalf of the parents, just the method of delivery is not the best. And then, of course, especially if you get to a kid, where later on you try to explain, and I'm sure if any has children go through this thing of everything is why, but why? And then, but why? It's like, oh, let me just tell you that doesn't exist. And it's a scary thing, if you're going to be the parent of a child that says, I can see, not even a ghost, because let's say I can see a holy, divine figure, whatever it is that you, for a parent, that's got to be like, what comes with this? What comes with being the parent of a child that is able to see this? That comes as far as why some parents, it's like, no, I wouldn't want my child to be this quote unquote holy, because sometimes, I hate to say it, it becomes more of a curse than a gift kind of deal. Yep. So anyway, guys, I hope you like this interview with Dr. Blinston. I think she's fascinating. I could talk to her about so many things. I'm going to put the credits, in the credits of the show, I'll put a link to her website. You heard it, where you could go visit her. Also, don't forget to sign up for my newsletter. Go to MiamiGhostChronicles.com or MarlenePardo.com. There's a little box there where you could sign up. Again, if you want to listen to any of the podcast versions of any of the series that I host or narrate, you're going to find links there, so where you could click and listen to either on your browser or download the MP3 file without any type of any type of commercial interruption. Again, the video versions of any of the series, you can find them on YouTube, on Rumble, on BitChute. I'm all over the place that has some type of video hosting service on Daily Motion. You're going to find me there. So again, but if you wanted links to all of that, go and visit MiamiGhostChronicles.com and you will find me there. Again, guys, come back next week. I have a bunch of great guests lined up. I know you're going to enjoy it. And again, thank you so much for being part of my audience. You're all great.